The morning mist clung to the Georgia wilderness like a shroud, and Nancy Hart wiped her calloused hands on her worn apron as she stepped outside her log cabin. The year was 1778, and the Revolutionary War had turned neighbor against neighbor in these remote hills. At 6 feet tall, with fiery red hair and piercing blue eyes, Nancy cut an imposing figure. Yet the British loyalists and even some of her own neighbors dismissed her as nothing more than a backwoods cook and mother. Her husband Benjamin had been away for weeks, serving with the Continental Forces, leaving Nancy alone with their children and the daily struggle of survival. The isolation of their homestead, nestled between towering pines and rocky outcroppings, had always been both blessing and curse. Today, as she watched smoke rising from distant fires, she sensed it might become their salvation or their doom. The Hart family had settled in this untamed corner of Georgia's Broad River region years before the war began. Nancy had learned early that survival meant more than keeping house and cooking meals. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was barely tall enough to hold a musket, and the Cherokee raids of her youth had sharpened those skills to a deadly precision. But in the eyes of most men, including the Tory raiders who increasingly plagued the area, she remained invisible except as a source of hot food and harmless gossip. That morning brought news that chilled her blood. Young Thomas Clark rode up on a lathered horse, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. The Loyalists had struck again, this time burning out the Williamson family just 5 miles south. Old man Williamson had been shot trying to defend his property, and his wife and daughters had barely escaped into the woods with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Nancy listened grimly as Thomas recounted the tale, her hands never stopping their work as she kneaded dough for the day's bread. The boy's eyes darted nervously to the tree line, expecting Tory raiders to emerge at any moment. His obvious terror sparked something fierce in Nancy's chest, but she kept her voice calm and steady. "They say there's a whole band of them now," Thomas continued, accepting the cup of buttermilk Nancy offered. "Maybe 20 or 30 men, led by that devil Brownlow and his sons. They're hitting every patriot family they can find, taking what they please and burning the rest." Nancy's jaw tightened at the mention of Brownlow. She knew the man by reputation, a violent loyalist who used the war as an excuse for the worst kind of banditry. His followers were little better than common thieves, though they wrapped their crimes in the British flag and claimed loyalty to the crown. "Where are they heading?" Nancy asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Word is they're working their way north along the river," Thomas replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some folks say they'll be here by nightfall. Others reckon we've got maybe a day or two before they reach this stretch of the valley." After Thomas rode away to spread the warning to other families, Nancy stood alone in her dooryard, studying the familiar landscape with new eyes. Every ridge and hollow, every game trail and creek crossing, she knew them all like the lines on her own hands. If the Tories came here, they would find her ready, though they would never expect what waited for them in this remote cabin. The truth was that Nancy Hart had been preparing for this moment longer than anyone realized. While other women focused on traditional domestic skills, Nancy had spent her spare time mastering the arts of woodcraft and warfare. She could track a deer through dense undergrowth, move silently through the forest at night, and shoot with an accuracy that would shame most men. Her neighbors knew her as a fierce woman with a sharp tongue, but they had never seen the full extent of her capabilities. Benjamin had always encouraged her unusual interests, recognizing that their isolated location demanded unconventional preparations. Together, they had cached supplies throughout the surrounding woods and planned escape routes for various scenarios. Nancy had even practiced moving through the forest while carrying their youngest children, timing herself until she could reach the river crossing in complete darkness. But running had never been Nancy's first instinct. She was a fighter by nature, someone who met challenges head-on rather than backing down. The thought of abandoning her home to British sympathizers filled her with a rage that burned hotter than the forge fire where she heated her iron cookware. As the day wore on, Nancy went through the motions of normal household routines while her mind raced through possibilities. She fed the chickens, milked the cow, and set beans to soak for tomorrow's meal, all while calculating angles of fire and reviewing the location of her husband's hidden weapons. Benjamin had left his best rifle with her, along with powder and shot, but Nancy had her own firearms that she maintained in secret. The children sensed the tension in the air, though Nancy tried to keep her demeanor calm and reassuring. 8-year-old Suki helped with the cooking in quiet concentration, while little Benjamin Jr. played with wooden toys near the hearth. Nancy's eldest, Morgan, had inherited his mother's size and temperament, and at 14 he was already nearly as tall as most grown men. Nancy could see him struggling with the desire to prove himself, but she knew he lacked the experience and seasoning for what might be coming. "Morgan," she called him over as evening approached, "I want you to take your brother and sister to the Williams place at first light tomorrow. Tell them I sent you to help with their harvest." The boy's face flushed with indignation. "Mama, I won't leave you here alone. If there's trouble coming, I should stay and fight." Nancy placed her hands on his shoulders, feeling how his muscles had strengthened from farm work and hunting. He was becoming a man, but he was not ready for the kind of violence that might visit their home. "Son, the bravest thing you can do is protect your siblings. If something happens to me, they'll need you more than ever." "But, Mama?" "No arguments, Morgan. This is not about courage or cowardice. This is about doing what needs to be done." Her voice carried the authority that had always made her children obey without question. But she softened it with a gentle touch to his cheek. "I've been taking care of myself in these woods longer than you've been alive. Trust that I know what I'm doing." That night, Nancy hardly slept. She moved restlessly through the cabin, checking window shutters and door bolts, reviewing her preparations one final time. The rifles were clean and loaded, positioned where she could reach them quickly from multiple locations. Extra powder and shot lay hidden in containers throughout the main room, disguised among her cooking supplies and household goods. But her greatest advantage lay not in her weapons, but in the underestimation of her enemies. To men like Brownlow and his followers, women existed in only two categories: victims to be plundered or sources of comfort to be exploited. They would enter her cabin expecting to find a frightened housewife cowering with her children, someone who could be easily intimidated into providing food, information, and perhaps other services. They had no idea they were about to encounter Nancy Hart. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the cabin's split-rail fence. Nancy sent the children away as planned, watching until they disappeared into the trees before allowing herself to feel the full weight of what lay ahead. She might never see them again, but at least they would be safe from whatever violence was about to unfold. Alone at last, Nancy shed the careful domesticity she had maintained for her children's benefit. She moved through her preparations with the focused intensity of a warrior preparing for battle. This was no longer the domain of Nancy the mother and housekeeper. This was the realm of Nancy the hunter, Nancy the fighter, Nancy the woman who had survived Cherokee raids and British regulars and would not be broken by a band of loyalist thieves. The morning passed slowly as Nancy waited and watched. She prepared food as usual, keeping up appearances while constantly listening for the sound of approaching horses. Every bird call and snapping twig set her nerves on edge, but she forced herself to remain patient. When they came, she would be ready. The Loyalists arrived just after noon, their horses snorting and stamping as they surrounded Nancy's cabin like wolves circling prey. From her position near the window, she counted 6 men, all armed and wearing the mixture of military uniforms and civilian clothes that marked them as irregular forces. Their leader, a stocky man with a graying beard, carried himself with the swagger of someone accustomed to intimidating defenseless families. Nancy recognized him immediately as Captain Brownlow, the same Tory raider who had terrorized the Williamson family. His cold eyes surveyed her property with the calculating gaze of a predator, taking note of the livestock, the sturdy cabin construction, and the well-maintained fields that suggested prosperity worth plundering. "Hello, the house!" Brownlow called out, his voice carrying the false joviality of a man who enjoyed his power over others. "We're loyal subjects of His Majesty seeking refreshment and information about rebel activities in these parts." Nancy stepped onto the cabin's small porch, wiping her hands on her apron in a gesture that seemed nervous, but actually brought her closer to the loaded pistol hidden beneath the cloth. She adopted the posture of a frightened countrywoman, allowing her shoulders to hunch slightly and letting a tremor creep into her voice. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she called back, playing the role they expected to see. "I'm just a poor woman trying to keep house while my husband serves the cause of liberty. I don't know nothing about no military matters." Brownlow dismounted with a harsh laugh, gesturing for his men to spread out around the cabin. "Liberty, you say? That's rebel talk, woman. Your husband fights against the lawful authority of the crown, which makes him a traitor, and you the wife of a traitor." Nancy forced herself to take a step backward, as if frightened by his words. In reality, she was positioning herself for a clear line of retreat into the cabin, where her rifle waited propped against the wall just inside the door. Every movement was calculated, though she made it appear random and fearful. "Please, sir," she said, injecting a pleading note into her voice that felt like swallowing poison. "I'm just trying to survive out here. I got children to feed and protect. I don't mean no harm to nobody." Two of Brownlow's men had circled around to the back of the cabin while the others positioned themselves to block any escape routes. Nancy noted their movements from the corner of her eye, marking each man's location and weapon status. The youngest of the group, barely out of boyhood, seemed nervous and kept checking his musket as if unsure of his ability to use it. The others moved with the confidence of experienced fighters who had done this many times before. "Where are your children now, woman?" demanded a lean, scarred man who had remained mounted. "And what about any hired hands or neighbors who might be visiting?" "My children are visiting relatives downstream," Nancy replied, which was true enough, though not for the reasons she implied. "And there ain't nobody else here but me? Times have been hard since the fighting started, and we can't afford to keep extra hands anymore." Brownlow stepped onto the porch, his boots heavy on the rough planking. Up close, Nancy could see the cruelty etched into the lines around his eyes and smell the whiskey on his breath. This was a man who enjoyed causing pain, who had found in the war an excuse to indulge his worst impulses without consequence. "Well then, it's just you and us," he said, with a smile that made Nancy's skin crawl. "And you're going to help us whether you want to or not. First, you're going to cook us a proper meal with whatever supplies you've got. Then you're going to tell us everything you know about patriot movements in this area. And after that..." He let the implication hang in the air like a threat. Nancy ducked her head submissively, though inside she felt the familiar surge of combat readiness that had served her well in past dangers. "Of course, sir. I'll do whatever you ask. I got fresh bread and bacon, and I can cook up some beans and cornbread if that would suit you." "That'll do fine," Brownlow agreed, settling himself into the wooden chair on the porch as if he owned the place. "Boys, see to the horses and keep watch. This might take a while." As Nancy moved toward the cabin door, she caught sight of movement in the distant tree line. For a moment, her heart leaped, thinking it might be Benjamin returning with Continental forces. But the movement was wrong, too furtive and careful. More loyalists, most likely, or perhaps scouts for a larger force. The situation was growing more complex by the moment. Inside the cabin, Nancy began preparing food with hands that appeared steady, but minds that raced through possibilities. The rifle stood where she had left it, but 6 armed men were too many to face in direct confrontation, especially if more might be coming. She needed to reduce the odds before making her move. Brownlow followed her inside, ostensibly to supervise but actually to intimidate through his presence. He wandered around the main room, picking up objects and examining them with the casual disregard of a conqueror inspecting his spoils. When he lifted the lid of Nancy's large cooking pot, she had to restrain herself from driving a knife into his back. "You keep a tidy house," he commented, setting down a pewter mug without regard for where it belonged. "Your rebel husband is a lucky man to have such a capable wife." The way he said capable made it clear he was thinking of capabilities that had nothing to do with housekeeping. Nancy began slicing bacon with a large kitchen knife, keeping the blade angled so that Brownlow couldn't see exactly how skillfully she handled it. Let him think her clumsy and harmless for as long as possible. Meanwhile, she listened carefully to the sounds from outside, tracking the movements and conversations of his men. "Tell me," Brownlow continued, settling into Benjamin's chair at the head of the table. "What do you know about the Continental forces in this region? How many men does your husband serve with? Where are they camped?" "I truly don't know much about such things," Nancy replied, adding wood to the fire with movements that brought her closer to the rifle. "Benjamin, he don't tell me nothing about military matters. Says it ain't fitting for a woman to concern herself with such things." "Smart man, your husband. Women who meddle in affairs beyond their understanding tend to come to bad ends." Brownlow's tone carried a clear warning, but Nancy detected something else underneath: uncertainty. He was trying to gauge how much she actually knew and whether she represented a threat to his operations in the area. Outside, she could hear his men growing restless. They had been in the saddle for hours, and the smell of cooking food was making them eager for rest and sustenance. Nancy began to see how she might use their hunger and fatigue against them. Relaxed men were careless men, and careless men made mistakes. "This bacon smells mighty fine," Brownlow observed, moving to look over her shoulder as she worked at the fire. "You know what would make this even better? Some of your husband's whiskey to wash it down. I'm sure a man fighting for liberty wouldn't begrudge loyal subjects a drink." Nancy felt his breath on her neck and had to summon every ounce of self-control to keep from spinning around and planting the kitchen knife between his ribs. Instead, she nodded toward a corner cabinet where Benjamin kept his small supply of corn liquor. "Help yourself, sir. Though I should warn you, my Benjamin makes it powerful strong." Brownlow moved away to investigate the whiskey, and Nancy allowed herself a small, grim smile. The alcohol would serve her purposes well if she could convince the raiders to indulge heavily. Drunk men were even more careless than tired ones, and their reflexes would be slowed when the moment came for action. As the afternoon wore on, Nancy played the perfect hostess while gathering intelligence about her enemies. She learned that Brownlow's band had been active for months, moving through the backcountry and terrorizing patriot families with virtual impunity. They had grown bold and overconfident, accustomed to encountering only frightened civilians who offered no meaningful resistance. The raiders outside had relaxed their vigilance as the smell of cooking food and the promise of rest worked their magic. Nancy could see them through the window, some sitting on stumps and fallen logs, others tending to their horses or cleaning their weapons with the casual attention of men who felt completely secure. They had no idea that the woman cooking their meal was studying every detail of their positions, weapons, and habits with the focused attention of a predator preparing to strike. They saw only what they expected to see, a frightened housewife going through the motions of fearful compliance. When Nancy finally served the meal, she made sure to keep Brownlow's cup filled with whiskey while appearing to drink modestly herself. She encouraged stories of their past raids, playing the awed audience to their boastful tales of violence and plunder. Each story revealed more about their methods, their strengths, and most importantly, their weaknesses. As evening approached and the whiskey flowed freely, Nancy began to sense that her moment was approaching. The raiders had grown loud and careless, their weapons set aside or handled with the casual disregard of men who felt completely safe. Brownlow himself was showing the effects of the strong drink, his movements becoming slightly unsteady and his attention wandering from the business of maintaining control. But Nancy's greatest advantage remained unchanged. They still saw her as nothing more than the cook, a harmless woman whose only value lay in her ability to provide food and service. That fundamental misunderstanding would be the last mistake they ever made. The moment came when Brownlow made his fatal mistake. Emboldened by whiskey and convinced of his complete control over the situation, he decided it was time to claim what he considered his due from the helpless woman who had served him so well. As shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, he rose unsteadily from the table and moved toward Nancy with predatory intent. "You've been mighty hospitable, woman," he said, his words slightly slurred from drink. "Time you showed some real appreciation for our protection. Boys," he called to his men outside, "keep watch while I conduct some private business with our hostess." Nancy continued cleaning dishes at the wash basin, her back to Brownlow as he approached. To him, she appeared resigned to her fate, shoulders slumped in defeat as she awaited the inevitable. But Nancy was actually calculating distances and angles, timing his approach while her hand moved imperceptibly toward the hidden pistol beneath her apron. "Please, sir," she said in a trembling voice that concealed the ice-cold calculation in her mind. "I've done everything you asked. Surely you can find it in your heart to show mercy to a poor woman." Brownlow's laugh was harsh and ugly. "Mercy? You rebels showed no mercy to loyal subjects when you started this war. Now it's time to pay the price for your husband's treason." He reached out to grab her shoulder, and Nancy spun like a striking snake. In one fluid motion, she drew the pistol from beneath her apron and pressed it against his throat, her finger already on the trigger. The transformation was so sudden and complete that Brownlow froze in shock, his alcohol-clouded mind struggling to process what had just happened. "The only treason here is yours, Captain," Nancy said in a voice that had shed every trace of fear or submission. "You and your men are nothing but thieves and murderers hiding behind the king's colors. Now you're going to call your boys in here, nice and peaceful-like, or I'll paint these walls with your brains." Brownlow's eyes widened as he finally saw Nancy Hart as she truly was. Not a frightened housewife, but a dangerous woman who knew exactly how to kill him. The barrel of the pistol pressed against his neck was steady as stone, and her blue eyes held the cold certainty of someone perfectly willing to pull the trigger. "You're making a terrible mistake, woman," he managed to whisper. "My men will hear the shot and come running. You might kill me, but they'll cut you down before you can reload." Nancy's smile was sharp as a blade. "Maybe so, Captain, but you'll be dead either way, and I reckon I can take a few more of your boys with me before they finish the job. The question is, are you ready to meet your maker today?" Before Brownlow could respond, Nancy called out loudly enough for his men to hear. "Captain Brownlow wants all you boys to come inside. He's got something important to tell you." Brownlow opened his mouth to countermand the order, but Nancy pressed the pistol harder against his throat, and he fell silent. Outside, they could hear his men stirring, some grumbling about leaving their comfortable positions, but ultimately obeying what they thought was their leader's command. "When they come through that door," Nancy whispered to Brownlow, "you're going to tell them to stack their weapons nice and neat, or I'll kill you where you stand. And don't think I won't do it. I've killed men before, and I sleep just fine at night." The first loyalist through the door was the young nervous one. his musket slung carelessly across his shoulder as he expected nothing more threatening than another round of drinking and storytelling. He stopped short when he saw Nancy holding a gun to his captain's throat, his mouth falling open in complete bewilderment. "What in hell?" he started to say. "Drop your weapon and move to the far corner," Nancy commanded, her voice carrying absolute authority. "Do it now, or watch your captain die." The young man looked desperately at Brownlow for guidance, but the captain could only nod slightly, the movement constrained by the pistol at his throat. With trembling hands, the raider unslung his musket and moved where Nancy had directed. The second man through the door was the lean, scarred veteran who had questioned Nancy earlier. He was quicker to assess the situation and immediately reached for his pistol, but Nancy was ready for him. Without releasing her grip on Brownlow, she spoke in a voice like winter wind. "Touch that weapon and your captain dies. Then I'll put the next ball through your chest before you can clear leather. I guarantee it." Something in her tone convinced him she meant every word. His hand froze halfway to his pistol, and after a long moment, he slowly raised both hands and moved to join his companion in the corner. The remaining 3 men entered together, drawn by the unnatural silence and their growing sense that something had gone terribly wrong. They pulled up short at the sight of their leader held at gunpoint by the woman they had dismissed as harmless prey. For a moment, the tableau held frozen, armed men facing an impossible reversal of power that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. Nancy seized the psychological moment when confusion and disbelief made them hesitate. "Gentlemen, your captain has just surrendered to the Continental forces," she announced with cool authority. "You'll stack your weapons by the door and move to the corner with your friends, or I'll start killing, beginning with Captain Brownlow." "Like hell!" snarled one of the men, a burly raider with missing teeth. "You're just one woman with one shot. Soon as you fire that pistol, we'll tear you apart." Nancy's response was swift and devastating. Without warning, she shifted her aim and fired, the pistol roaring in the confined space of the cabin. The ball took the defiant raider in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor where he writhed in pain and shock. Before the echo of the shot had faded, Nancy had released Brownlow and dove across the cabin to where Benjamin's rifle waited. Her movements were fluid and practiced, showing none of the clumsiness she had feigned earlier. In seconds, she had the long gun in her hands and was bringing it to bear on the remaining raiders. "That was my warning shot," she said calmly, as if she hadn't just put a man on the floor. "The next one goes through someone's heart. Your choice, gentlemen." The sight of Nancy handling the rifle with obvious expertise finally shattered their illusions about her capabilities. This was no frightened housewife cowering before superior force. This was a warrior who had lured them into a trap with cold-blooded calculation, and now she held the advantage despite being outnumbered. Brownlow, freed from the immediate threat to his throat, made a desperate grab for his pistol where he had set it on the table. Nancy's rifle swung toward him with practiced ease, and he found himself staring down the barrel of a weapon held by someone who clearly knew how to use it. "I wouldn't, Captain," Nancy advised in a conversational tone. "Benjamin keeps this rifle loaded with a double charge and 2 balls. At this range, it'll cut you clean in half." The captain's hand froze inches from his pistol. Around the cabin, his men stood in various stages of surrender and indecision, their easy confidence completely destroyed by the reversal of fortune. The wounded man on the floor continued to moan and clutch his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. Nancy kept the rifle trained on Brownlow while addressing his men. "Now then, boys, let's try this again. Weapons on the floor, nice and easy. Anyone who makes me nervous is going to join your friend on the floor, except they won't be getting back up." This time, there was no hesitation. Pistols and muskets clattered to the wooden floor as the raiders complied with her demands. Nancy gestured with the rifle barrel for them to move away from their weapons and group themselves in the corner where she could watch them all. "That's better," she said approvingly. "Now we can have a civilized conversation. Captain Brownlow, you and your boys have been terrorizing innocent families throughout this valley, stealing their property, burning their homes, and worse. The way I see it, that makes you nothing but a pack of thieves and murderers." "We're soldiers fighting for the crown," Brownlow protested, though his voice lacked its earlier arrogance. "Soldiers don't make war on women and children," Nancy replied coldly. "Soldiers don't burn farms and steal livestock from defenseless families. You're bandits, plain and simple, and bandits deserve a bandit's justice." She moved to the window, keeping the rifle pointed in their general direction while glancing outside to ensure no additional enemies were approaching. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her property, and she could see their horses still tied where they had left them. No sign of the additional forces she had glimpsed earlier. Perhaps they had been scouts from a different group, or perhaps they had moved on to easier targets. "Here's what's going to happen," Nancy continued, turning back to her prisoners. "You're going to remain exactly where you are while I decide what to do with you. Any man who moves without permission gets shot. Any man who speaks without permission gets shot. Any man who even looks at me wrong gets shot. Are we clear on the rules?" Nods and mumbled agreements came from the corner. The wounded man had stopped moaning and was trying to apply pressure to his shoulder wound with a torn piece of his shirt. Nancy noted that the ball had passed through cleanly. He would live, though he would carry the scar for the rest of his days as a reminder of underestimating the wrong woman. As the minutes ticked by, Nancy considered her options. 6 men, even wounded and disarmed, represented too many prisoners for one woman to handle safely over an extended period. She needed to reduce their numbers or find a way to secure them permanently. The nearest Continental forces were days away, and she couldn't abandon her post to escort prisoners that distance. The solution came to her with cold clarity. She would give them a choice: justice or mercy delivered on her terms. "Gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying across the cabin like a judge pronouncing sentence. "You stand accused of crimes against innocent civilians in time of war. The penalty for such crimes is death, which I am fully prepared to administer here and now." Terror flickered across their faces as they realized she was completely serious. This woman who had served them dinner was now calmly discussing their execution with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. "However," Nancy continued, "I am prepared to offer an alternative. You will swear a sacred oath never to take up arms against the Continental forces or their supporters again. You will leave this valley immediately and never return. And you will spread the word to every loyalist raider you encounter that the families of this region are under my protection." She paused to let her words sink in before delivering the final terms. "Break that oath, and I will hunt you down personally. Continue your raids elsewhere, and I will find you. Harm another innocent family, and I will make you pray for the quick death I'm offering you today." Do I make myself clear? The silence stretched for long moments before Brownlow finally spoke, his voice hoarse with defeat and humiliation. "We agree to your terms, woman. We swear the oath you demand." Nancy smiled coldly. "The name is Mrs. Hart, and you'll address me properly when you speak that oath, Captain. After all, I wouldn't want there to be any confusion about who just defeated 6 armed men with nothing but superior planning and better shooting." One by one, the raiders swore their oath to Mrs. Nancy Hart, the woman they had dismissed as just the cook, until she wielded a rifle and showed them the true meaning of underestimation. As they mounted their horses and rode away into the gathering darkness, they carried with them a lesson that would spread throughout the backcountry. There was more than one way to serve the cause of liberty, and some of the deadliest patriots wore aprons instead of uniforms. Nancy watched until they disappeared into the forest, then calmly began cleaning her weapons and preparing for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The war was far from over, but her corner of Georgia was secure under the protection of a woman who proved that courage and skill mattered more than anyone's expectations about who could wield them.